In the heartwarming tale of Hope's Haven, Molly Carter fights to save her struggling animal shelter after inheriting it from her late brother. She discovers Buddy, a loyal dog who waits outside a hospital for his owner, who will never return. Together with Dr. Ethan Reed, a reserved pediatrician grappling with his own loss, Molly uncovers Buddy's touching story and uses it to rally the community behind her shelter. Facing relentless opposition from Nathan Hale, a corrupt developer intent on shutting down the shelter, Molly and Ethan inspire the town to unite, leading to a courtroom showdown that redefines the meaning of resilience and hope. As Buddy becomes a symbol of second chances, the shelter expands into a nationwide movement, touching countless lives. In the end, Hope's Haven isn't just a place for animals, it's a beacon of compassion and healing for all. What do you think of Buddy's journey and the resilience of Hope's Haven? Are you watching from the heart of a big city or a cozy small town? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to DG's Story for more captivating tales of hope, loyalty, and transformation. Your next favorite story is just a click away. Hopfield was a small town along the banks of the Ohio River, its charm resting in its simplicity. The town's main street was lined with mom-and-pop shops, a single diner, and a post office that seemed frozen in time. Surrounding the town were vast cornfields, their golden stalks swaying gently in the breeze, and a scattering of red brick farmhouses that had housed generations of families. Hopfield was a place where everyone knew everyone, and yet for some, this closeness could feel stifling. Ethan Reed was one of those people. A pediatrician at Hopfield Hospital, Ethan had spent nearly 10 years caring for the town's youngest residents. He was diligent and efficient, with a reputation for being all business. Parents trusted him, nurses respected him, and children admired him for his patience. But outside of work, Ethan was a ghost. The tragedy that had struck him a year ago was no secret in Hopfield. A drunk driver had collided with his car on a rainy night, killing his wife and 6-year-old daughter instantly. Ethan had survived, but the man who had walked out of the wreckage was not the same. He became withdrawn, burying himself in work to avoid the echoes of his family's laughter that haunted his empty home. In a town that prided itself on community, Ethan remained resolutely alone. Every night, as Ethan left the hospital after his shift, he noticed a dog lying near the revolving glass doors. The dog was a medium-sized mix with matted fur, a patchy tail, and soulful brown eyes. Hospital staff had nicknamed him Buddy, and though some tried to coax him away with scraps of food or warm blankets, Buddy never moved far from the entrance. It was the middle of winter, and the cold had turned biting. Ethan exited the hospital one evening, tightening his coat against the wind. As always, Buddy was there, his small body curled tightly into a ball, his breath visible in the freezing air. "Still here, huh?" Ethan muttered, pausing briefly to study the dog. Buddy lifted his head, his ears twitching at the sound of Ethan's voice. Their eyes met, and for a fleeting moment, Ethan felt a strange connection. The dog's gaze seemed to hold both pain and hope, as if silently pleading for someone to understand him. Ethan shook his head and walked away, dismissing the feeling as a trick of his exhausted mind. But as he drove home, the image of Buddy stayed with him, etched into the back of his thoughts like a puzzle waiting to be solved. Across town, Molly Carter was facing her own struggles. Hope's Haven, the animal rescue shelter her family had built 2 decades ago, was on the brink of collapse. Molly's brother, Jackson, had been the heart and soul of the operation. His passion for animals and his uncanny ability to rally community support had kept the shelter thriving. But when Jackson passed away unexpectedly a year ago, the responsibility of managing the shelter fell to Molly. She was determined to honor her brother's memory, but keeping Hope's Haven afloat proved harder than she'd imagined. The bills were piling up, donations had dwindled, and the once bustling shelter now housed only a handful of animals. Molly worked tirelessly, often sleeping meals and sleeping on a cot in the shelter's office. But it never seemed to be enough. One evening, as Molly sat scrolling through her phone in the dimly lit office, a headline caught her eye. "Loyal dog waits outside hospital every night for his owner." The article described Buddy's nightly vigil outside Hopfield Hospital, a sight familiar to many in the community. The story struck a chord with Molly. She felt an immediate kinship with the dog, imagining the kind of loyalty that would keep him waiting night after night in the freezing cold. She decided to visit the hospital the next day, hoping to learn more about Buddy. If she could connect his story to Hope's Haven, perhaps it could spark a wave of interest and donations for the shelter. Molly arrived at the hospital the following morning and asked to speak with someone about the dog. Her inquiries eventually led her to Dr. Ethan Reed. Ethan had just finished his rounds and was on his way to grab a cup of coffee when Molly intercepted him. "Dr. Reed, I'm Molly Carter," she introduced herself with a firm handshake. "I run Hope's Haven, the animal rescue shelter. I wanted to talk to you about the dog that's been staying outside the hospital." Ethan raised an eyebrow, caught off guard by her directness. "Buddy? What about him?" "I don't want to talk about it." "Well, his story has been making waves online, and I think he could help us raise awareness for the shelter," Molly explained, her voice tinged with urgency. "But first, I want to find out more about him, who he belongs to, why he's here." Ethan's first instinct was to brush her off. He didn't have time for this. He barely had time for himself. But then he thought of Buddy's eyes, the way they seemed to reach into his soul every time he passed by the hospital doors. Against his better judgment, he nodded. "Fine," he said, "but I'm not promising anything." As Molly and Ethan began piecing together Buddy's story, neither realized how deeply their lives would be intertwined with the dog's. What started as a simple quest to uncover Buddy's past would soon become a journey of healing, hope, and redemption for them all. Ethan and Molly's investigation began simply enough. Armed with nothing but curiosity and determination, they started asking questions around the hospital and the surrounding neighborhood. It didn't take long to discover that Buddy's presence had become something of a local legend. "People say he showed up about 3 weeks ago," said Ms. Harris, the hospital receptionist, as she handed Ethan a stack of patient files one afternoon. "Right around the time Mr. Donnelly passed away. You remember him, don't you? He was in room 314. Ethan vaguely recalled Mr. Donnelly, an elderly man with no known family who had succumbed to a long illness. The thought of Buddy waiting outside for someone who would never return sent a pang through his chest. Could it be that Buddy was Mr. Donnelly's dog? Was that how he had slowly come to wish? "Poor dog's probably grieving," Ms. Harris added, her voice softening. "Just like the rest of us when we lose someone." Ethan relayed this information to Molly later that evening. They sat across from each other at a diner booth, Buddy curled up at Molly's feet. "If Buddy belonged to Mr. Donnelly, it would explain a lot," Ethan said, stirring his coffee absently. "But how did Buddy get here?" Molly asked, leaning forward. "And why wasn't he with Mr. Donnelly at the end?" These were questions neither of them could answer. Determined to dig deeper, Molly suggested visiting Mr. Donnelly's former home. If they could find any clues about Buddy's past, it might help them piece together the story. The next day, Ethan and Molly drove to the address listed in Mr. Donnelly's hospital records. It was a modest single-story house with peeling paint and an overgrown yard. The sight of it was strangely melancholic, a reflection of a life lived quietly and without much fanfare. The house was locked, but a neighbor watering her plants nearby noticed them lingering on the front porch. "You looking for something?" she called out, eyeing them with mild suspicion. "We're trying to find out more about Mr. Donnelly," Molly explained, stepping forward with a friendly smile. "He used to live here, right?" The woman nodded, setting down her watering can. "He did. Lived here alone for years. Sweet man, but very private, always kept to himself. She glanced down at Buddy, who was sniffing the edge of the porch. "Oh, that's his dog, isn't it? He called him Buddy. You know those two were inseparable." Hearing this, Ethan and Molly exchanged a look. They were getting closer to the truth, but the neighbor's next words sent a chill through them. "Poor thing must have run off after Mr. Donnelly passed. I thought he'd just disappeared, but now he's here, waiting." As they drove back from Mr. Donnelly's house, the car was unusually silent. Molly glanced at Buddy, who lay quietly in the back seat, his head resting on his paws. His subdued demeanor mirrored the heaviness she felt. "What kind of life do you think they had?" Molly asked softly, breaking the silence. Ethan kept his eyes on the road. "Simple, I'd imagine. Just the two of them. It sounds like Mr. Donnelly didn't have anyone else. I do the ellipticals. I'm silent. My shirt is like woven of that mist." Sand stopped. Molly nodded, her heart aching for both the man and the dog. The idea of Buddy waiting every night for someone who would never return was almost too much to bear. "We have to do something," she said suddenly, her voice firm. Ethan glanced at her. "Like what?" "Give Buddy a home. Tell his story. If people knew what he's been through, maybe they'd see what Hope's Haven is all about. We're not just a shelter, we're a place for second chances." Ethan hesitated. He admired Molly's passion, but he wasn't sure turning Buddy into a public figure was the answer. Still, he couldn't deny that the dog's story was compelling, and if it could help save Hope's Haven, maybe it was worth a try. Later that evening, Molly brought Buddy to Hope's Haven. The shelter was quiet. Its few remaining residents, a pair of elderly cats and a shy terrier, settled in for the night. Molly set up a cozy corner for Buddy in her office, complete with a soft blanket and a bowl of fresh water. "Welcome home, Buddy," she said gently, kneeling beside him. Buddy sniffed his new surroundings cautiously before curling up on the blanket. For the first time in weeks, he seemed at ease. Molly watched him for a moment, a small smile tugging at her lips. But her relief was short-lived. Her phone buzzed with a notification, and when she checked it, her smile faded. It was an email from Nathan Hale, the real estate developer who had been pressuring her to sell the shelter's property. "Hope's Haven has had its time," the email read. "It's time to make way for something new. I'll be in touch." Molly's hands trembled as she set the phone down. She had been fighting Nathan's advances for months, but the shelter's financial situation was dire. If she couldn't find a way to turn things around soon, she might not have a choice. The next morning, Molly called Ethan. "I need your help," she said, without preamble. Ethan sighed. "What now?" "I want to organize an event, something to raise awareness for Buddy's story and Hope's Haven. We'll need the community's support if we're going to survive." Ethan hesitated. "Molly, I'm not exactly a people person, you know that." "You don't have to be," Molly said. "Just be there for Buddy, that's all I'm asking." After a long pause, Ethan finally agreed. "Fine, but only because of the dog. I'd love to get one too." Molly wasted no time organizing the event. She called it Buddy's Night, a gathering meant to celebrate the dog's loyalty and raise funds for Hope's Haven. Flyers were posted around town, and local businesses donated supplies and refreshments. Despite her excitement, Molly couldn't shake the nagging doubt that it might not be enough. Ethan, true to his word, showed up on the night of the event with Buddy in tow. The town square had been transformed with twinkling lights and folding chairs set up in front of a small stage. A modest crowd had gathered, families, pet owners, and curious onlookers drawn by Buddy's story. Molly took the stage, her voice trembling slightly as she addressed the crowd. "Thank you all for coming tonight," she began. "Hope's Haven is more than just a shelter. It's a place where animals like Buddy can find hope again. but we can't do it alone." She gestured to Ethan, who stood off to the side with Buddy. At her cue, Ethan walked Buddy onto the stage. The dog's calm demeanor and soulful eyes immediately captivated the audience. "This is Buddy," Molly continued. "For weeks, he waited outside Hopfield Hospital, hoping to see his owner one last time. Even when he had nothing, Buddy never gave up. That's the kind of loyalty we can all learn from." The crowd erupted into applause, and Molly felt a flicker of hope. But not everyone in the audience was moved. Near the back of the square, Nathan Hale stood with a smug expression, flanked by two associates. As the applause died down, he stepped forward, his voice cutting through the crowd. "Loyalty is admirable," Nathan said, "but let's not forget reality. Hope's Haven is struggling, and sentiment won't pay the bills." "Reality, we love Hope's Haven." "Loyalty," Liso said. A murmur spread through the crowd, and Molly's chest tightened. She had expected resistance from Nathan, but not so publicly. Ethan stepped forward, surprising everyone, including Molly. "Reality doesn't mean giving up," he said firmly. "Buddy didn't give up, and neither should we. Hope's Haven isn't just a shelter. It's a symbol of what this town stands for." Nathan smirked but said nothing, retreating into the crowd. Molly gave Ethan a grateful look, her resolve strengthened by his support. The event ended on a high note, with donations exceeding Molly's expectations. Several townspeople approached her afterward, offering to volunteer or spread the word about the shelter. Even Ethan, despite his initial reluctance, admitted that the night had been a success. As Molly and Ethan walked back to the shelter with Buddy trotting between them, she couldn't help but feel a sense of optimism. "We did it," she said quietly. It was the latest model of the mid-50s muffin trolley she had bought, and she appreciated the greater hints it gave. Ethan nodded but remained cautious. This was just the first step. Nathan's not going to back down that easily. "I know," Molly said, determination flickering in her eyes. "But neither are we." Unquote. Nathan Hale wasn't one to let things go quietly. The morning after Buddy's night, he launched a smear campaign against Hope's Haven. Posters appeared around town claiming the shelter was mismanaged and unsafe for animals. Social media posts accused Molly of using Buddy's story as a publicity stunt to cover up the shelter's financial troubles. The rumors spread quickly, fueled by Nathan's connections and his ability to manipulate public perception. For a town like Hopfield, where gossip traveled faster than facts, the accusations struck a nerve. Donations slowed, and Molly's inbox was flooded with emails from concerned residents demanding answers. Molly was furious but refused to let Nathan's tactics derail her efforts. "He wants us to panic," she told Ethan during a meeting at the shelter. "If we fall apart, he wins." Ethan, skeptical of his own involvement, asked, "So what's the plan?" "We double down," Molly said firmly. "We show everyone what Hope's Haven really stands for." Inspired by Molly's determination, Ethan began to take a more active role in the shelter's operations. Together they brainstormed ways to rebuild trust and demonstrate the shelter's value to the community. The first step was opening Hope's Haven to the public. Molly organized an open house weekend, inviting townspeople to tour the facility and meet the animals. Ethan, reluctantly stepping into the spotlight, offered free veterinary checkups for pets as part of the event. The weekend was a surprising success. Families came in droves, bringing their pets and leaving with a newfound appreciation for the shelter's work. Children played with the animals, and local businesses donated supplies to support the shelter. Even a few skeptical voices in the community admitted they had underestimated Hope's Haven. But not everyone was convinced. Nathan watched from a distance, his jaw tightening as he saw the renewed energy surrounding the shelter. If anything, the open house had only fueled his resolve to shut it down. Buddy, meanwhile, had become the unofficial mascot of Hope's Haven. His story continued to resonate with people, and visitors often asked to meet the loyal hospital dog. Molly decided to embrace Buddy's popularity, creating a social media account to share updates about him and the shelter's animals. The posts quickly gained traction. Photos of Buddy lounging in the shelter office or playing with rescued puppies received hundreds of likes and shares. People from neighboring towns started visiting Hope's Haven, drawn by Buddy's story and the shelter's mission. For the first time in months, Molly felt like they were making progress, but deep down she knew Nathan wasn't finished, and that the hardest battles were yet to come. Second bite. Just as things seemed to be turning around, disaster struck. One evening, Molly returned to the shelter after running errands and noticed something was wrong. Buddy, who usually greeted her at the door, was nowhere to be found. She searched the property, calling his name, but there was no sign of him. Panic set in as Molly realized Buddy wasn't just missing, he had likely been taken. A quick check of the shelter's security cameras confirmed her worst fears. Two figures in hooded jackets had broken into the shelter and carried Buddy away in the middle of the night. Molly immediately called Ethan, her voice trembling. "Buddy's gone! Someone took him!" Ethan arrived within minutes, his face grim as he reviewed the footage. "This isn't random," he said. "Nathan's behind this. It has to be." Molly clenched her fists, anger bubbling beneath her fear. "He's crossed the line. We have to get Buddy back." The next day, Molly and Ethan began a full-scale search for Buddy. They filed a police report, distributed flyers, and rallied the community to help look for him. Social media exploded with posts about Buddy's disappearance, and the shelter's followers shared the news far and wide. What's more, everyone had begun looking for Buddy themselves. Despite their efforts, days passed with no leads. Molly grew increasingly despondent, blaming herself for not protecting Buddy better. Ethan tried to reassure her, but his own frustration was evident. "This isn't your fault," he told her one evening as they sat in the empty shelter office. "We'll find him." Molly shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "What if we don't? What if Nathan's already—" "Don't go there," Ethan interrupted firmly. "We'll find him." Just when hope was beginning to fade, a breakthrough came in the form of an anonymous tip. A man claiming to have seen Buddy provided a description that matched the dog perfectly. According to the tipster, Buddy had been spotted at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. Ethan and Molly didn't hesitate. Armed with nothing but flashlights and determination, they drove to the warehouse late at night. The building loomed in the darkness, its broken windows and rusted exterior adding to the sense of foreboding. Inside, the air was damp and heavy. Molly's heart pounded as she called out Buddy's name, her voice echoing through the cavernous space. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, faintly, they heard it. "Oh!" a whimper. "Oh, Buddy!" Molly cried, sprinting toward the sound. They found him tied to a post in a corner of the warehouse, his tail wagging weakly as they approached. Molly knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she untied the ropes. "I'm so sorry, Buddy," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Ethan kept watch as they prepared to leave, his jaw tightening as he noticed fresh tire tracks leading away from the warehouse. Whoever had taken Buddy was still out there, and they weren't finished. The next morning, Molly and Ethan went straight to the police with the evidence they had gathered from the warehouse. Tire tracks, photos of Buddy tied up, and the security footage from the shelter painted a clear picture, but it wasn't enough to directly implicate Nathan Hale. He's too careful," Ethan muttered as they left the station. "There's no way he's going to leave a trail back to himself." Molly's frustration boiled over. "So what are we supposed to do? Just wait for him to try something else?" Stone wrinkled his forehead. "I have no idea." "No, Ethan replied firmly. "We need to force his hand." That evening, Molly and Ethan devised a plan. They would organize a press conference to publicly share Buddy's story and call out the people responsible for his kidnapping. If Nathan was behind it, the increased scrutiny might deter him or push him into making a mistake. The town square was packed the next day as Molly stepped up to the podium. Cameras from local news stations flashed, and a sea of curious faces looked up at her. Buddy sat at her feet, his presence a calming anchor. "Thank you all for coming," Molly began, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. Hope's Haven has always been about giving animals a second chance. But recently, someone tried to take that chance away from Buddy. She recounted the events of Buddy's disappearance, her words carefully chosen to avoid outright accusations, while still making it clear that this was no random act. "Buddy is more than just a dog," she said. "He's a symbol of loyalty and resilience, and we won't let anyone take that away." Ethan stood nearby, scanning the crowd for any sign of Nathan. Sure enough, Nathan was there, standing toward the back with his arms crossed. His expression was unreadable, but Ethan could feel the tension radiating from him. When the press conference ended, Nathan approached Molly, his smile thin and cold. "Quite the performance," he said. "But do you really think this changes anything?" Molly met his gaze without flinching. "I think people like you thrive in the shadows, but now the whole town is watching. Let's see how far you're willing to go." Nathan's smile faltered for a moment before he turned and walked away. The press conference had an immediate impact. Donations poured in, volunteers signed up to help at the shelter, and the local media began running stories about Buddy and Hope's Haven. But it wasn't just local attention that the story garnered. Animal rights organizations from across the state reached out, offering support and resources. One group even proposed partnering with Hope's Haven to launch a statewide campaign promoting animal welfare. For the first time in months, Molly felt like they had the upper hand, but Ethan remained cautious. "Nathan won't back down that easily," he warned. Molly nodded, her resolve unshaken. "Let him come, we'll be ready." Nathan was far from finished. In private meetings with his associates, he laid out a plan to undercut Hope's Haven once and for all. Using his extensive network, he began planting fake reports about the shelter. These reports claimed that the shelter was overrun with sick animals and that Molly was mismanaging funds. Within days, whispers began circulating around town. Some of the newly pledged donors hesitated, and a few local supporters withdrew their backing. Molly noticed the change almost immediately. External controls on the matter were needed, but the lisp of closure still clung. "Pulling out," she said, frustration evident in her voice as she paced the shelter office. "He's poisoning everything we've worked for." Ethan frowned, scrolling through the fabricated reports on his phone. "These lies are too specific to be random. He's targeting us, Molly. But we can fight this." "How?" she demanded. "It's his word against ours." "We counter his lies with the truth," Ethan said. "We invite transparency. Let the community see everything for themselves." Taking Ethan's advice, Molly announced another open house at Hope's Haven, this time inviting local media and community leaders to tour the facility. Volunteers worked tirelessly to prepare the shelter, cleaning every corner and ensuring all the animals were in their best condition. On the day of the event, the shelter was flooded with visitors. Families, reporters, and even city officials showed up, eager to see for themselves whether the rumors were true. Molly and Ethan led tours, answering questions and showcasing the improvements they had made in recent months. Buddy, as always, was a highlight. Visitors were drawn to his calm demeanor and his now famous story of resilience. For many, seeing Buddy in person solidified their belief in Hope's Haven and its mission. By the end of the day, the shelter had regained much of the support it had lost. Donations resumed, and the fabricated reports began to lose credibility as more people shared their positive experiences from the open house. That evening, as Molly and Ethan reviewed the day's successes, they received an unexpected visitor. A woman in her late 40s introduced herself as Sarah Bennett, a former employee of Nathan Hale. "I've been following your story," Sarah said, her voice low, "and I think you deserve to know the kind of person you're up against." She handed them a folder filled with documents. Emails, financial records, and memos linking Nathan to various unethical practices, including his attempts to discredit Hope's Haven. Molly stared at the folder in disbelief. "Why are you helping us?" Sarah's expression hardened. "Because I've seen what Nathan does to people who stand in his way. It's time someone stood up to him." With Sarah Bennett's documents in hand, Molly and Ethan now had the evidence they needed to expose Nathan Hale's unethical practices. The folder contained a trove of damning information, falsified reports, bribes paid to local officials, and direct communications ordering the smear campaign against Hope's Haven. The cost was passed on to the commission, and each bribe helped. "This is it," Molly said, her voice steady with resolve. "This is how we stop him." Ethan nodded. "But we need to do it carefully. If we release this the wrong way, he'll twist it into something else." Together, they devised a strategy. Molly reached out to a trusted local journalist, Emily Carter, who had a reputation for exposing corruption. Emily agreed to write an investigative piece on Nathan, using the documents as her primary source. The article was published in the local paper the following week, and its impact was immediate. Titled, "The Man Behind the Mask, Nathan Hale's Web of Lies," it laid out Nathan's attempts to sabotage Hope's Haven and his broader pattern of exploiting small-town communities for personal gain. The town erupted in outrage. People who had once supported Nathan's development projects turned on him, demanding accountability. Local officials who had accepted his bribes scrambled to distance themselves from him. And Nathan's reputation crumbled almost overnight. At Hope's Haven, Molly and Ethan watched the fallout unfold with a mixture of relief and disbelief. For the first time in months, it felt like the odds were finally in their favor. But Nathan wasn't going down without a fight. He held a press conference, denying the allegations, and accusing Molly and Ethan of fabricating the documents to save their shelter. His defiance only fueled the backlash as more evidence surfaced to corroborate Emily's article. Despite Nathan's efforts, the tide had turned. The community rallied around Hope's Haven, organizing fundraisers, donating supplies, and offering volunteer hours. Local businesses that had once hesitated to support the shelter now lined up to pledge their backing. Buddy's story, which had been at the heart of the shelter's revival, continued to inspire people far beyond Hopfield. Animal rights organizations across the state reached out to collaborate, and Hope's Haven became a symbol of resilience and justice. Ethan, who had once kept his distance from everyone, found himself at the center of the shelter's growing network of supporters. Though he still struggled with his own grief, being part of something larger than himself had started to heal old wounds. In the end, Nathan's empire collapsed. Facing legal action and widespread public condemnation, he was forced to abandon his development projects in Hopfield and retreat from the spotlight. Hope's Haven, once on the brink of closure, emerged stronger than ever. As Molly and Ethan stood outside the shelter one evening, watching Buddy play with a group of rescued puppies, Molly turned to Ethan with a smile. "We did it," she said softly. Ethan nodded, a rare smile crossing his face. "No," he replied. "You did it." Molly shook her head. "We all did it. And we're just getting started." End quote. Paul J. Edwards, author of the story. Buddy barked happily as if in agreement, and the three of them stood there, a testament to the power of loyalty, resilience, and hope. Despite Nathan's downfall, Molly and Ethan knew their fight wasn't entirely over. Rumors began to circulate that Nathan had sold his remaining stake in the development project to an anonymous buyer. The new investor, a corporate entity with deep pockets, filed a lawsuit against Hope's Haven, claiming the shelter was illegally occupying land slated for commercial use. The lawsuit struck fear into the hearts of everyone at Hope's Haven. "This is his last move," Ethan said grimly as he reviewed the court documents. "If he can't destroy us directly, he's going to let someone else finish the job." Molly refused to back down. "We've come too far to give up now," she said. "If they want a fight, we'll give them one." Determined to fight the lawsuit, Molly and Ethan rallied the community once again. They organized town hall meetings to explain the situation, gathering signatures for a petition to preserve the shelter's land. Local lawyers volunteered their services, and the shelter's growing network of supporters pledged to cover legal fees. Buddy, as always, played a central role in their efforts. His story continued to inspire people, drawing attention to the larger issue of protecting spaces dedicated to animal welfare. Molly created a heartfelt video featuring Buddy and other rescued animals, which quickly went viral. Donations poured in from across the country, strengthening their resolve. The day of the court hearing arrived, and the small-town courthouse was packed with supporters. Molly and Ethan sat at the plaintiff's table with their legal team, while the opposing side, led by a slick corporate lawyer, presented their case. The lawyer argued that the shelter had outlived its purpose, and that the land could be better utilized for economic development. He claimed that keeping the shelter open was a sentimental decision, not a practical one. Molly's lawyer countered with a passionate defense of the shelter's mission, citing its impact on the community and the growing need for animal welfare facilities. He presented evidence of the shelter's recent successes, including the partnerships they had formed with statewide organizations. Ethan took the stand to testify about his experiences with Buddy and the shelter. Though he was uncomfortable speaking in front of so many people, his sincerity and emotion shone through. "This shelter isn't just a place for animals," he said. "It's a place for healing, for all of us." As Ethan stepped down, Molly noticed a shift in the courtroom. Even the judge seemed moved by his words. But the battle was far from over. As the defense rested their case, the corporate lawyer wasted no time launching a counterattack. He accused Molly of running an unsustainable operation, pointing to past financial struggles and the shelter's near closure months earlier. "You claim this shelter is vital," the lawyer said, his voice sharp. "But isn't it true that without donations from a few viral moments, Hope's Haven would have been forced to shut down?" Molly felt her stomach churn as she took the stand. "Yes, we've faced challenges," she admitted, meeting his gaze. "But that doesn't mean what we do isn't important. Hope's Haven has given countless animals and people a second chance. That's worth fighting for." The lawyer smirked, unfazed. "And yet, you've relied on emotional appeals rather than sound financial planning. What happens when the public loses interest in Buddy and your shelter?" Molly's hands gripped the edge of the witness stand, but before she could respond, Ethan rose to his feet. "Objection," he said firmly. "She's here to talk about the shelter's mission, not hypothetical situations." The judge nodded. "Sustained. Move on, counselor." The lawyer narrowed his eyes but continued, shifting his focus to the land itself. He presented documents showing that the property had been rezoned for commercial use years earlier, implying that Molly had no legal right to remain there. A dog installed higher up showed the ringed staircase on the right and the furniture alternating with the land. Just when it seemed like the opposition had the upper hand, Sarah Bennett, the former employee of Nathan Hale, entered the courtroom. She carried a folder of additional documents and requested to testify as a witness. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as Sarah took the stand. "I worked for Nathan Hale for over 5 years," she began. "And I can confirm that he orchestrated the rezoning of this land through backdoor deals and falsified records. The corporate lawyer immediately objected, but the judge allowed Sarah's testimony. She revealed emails and memos detailing Nathan's underhanded tactics, including his attempts to use the rezoning to push out Hope's Haven and sell the land at a profit. Molly felt a surge of hope as Sarah's testimony dismantled much of the opposition's argument. But she also knew that the outcome still rested on the judge's decision. As the hearing stretched into the afternoon, tensions in the courtroom grew palpable. During a recess, Molly sat quietly with Buddy at her feet. She stroked his fur, drawing comfort from his calm presence. "Do you think we're doing enough?" she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. Buddy lifted his head, his deep brown eyes meeting hers. In that moment, Molly felt an unspoken reassurance. They had fought for Buddy, and now Buddy's story was fighting for them. As the court reconvened, the judge's expression was neutral but stern. She addressed both sides, making it clear that this case was not just about emotional appeals, but about the law. "This courtroom does not operate on sentiment," she said, her gaze sweeping across the room. "While I appreciate the passion both sides have shown, I will base my decision on the facts and the merits of the case." Molly exchanged a nervous glance with Ethan. The weight of the judge's words hung heavily over them. They had done everything they could to present a compelling case, but now the outcome was beyond their control. The final phase of the hearing brought a surprise witness for the defense, a respected urban planner who argued that the land Hope's Haven occupied would serve the community better as a commercial development. "Development creates jobs," the planner said confidently. "And Hopfield could use the economic boost. A shelter, while noble, doesn't generate the same long-term benefits." The words sent a ripple through the courtroom. Molly felt her resolve falter, but Ethan leaned over and whispered, "Stay strong. They're wrong about this." When it was Molly's turn for a final statement, she stood tall, her voice steady. "Hope's Haven isn't just about saving animals," she said. "It's about saving people, too. This shelter has brought our community together. It's given us purpose, hope, and something to believe in. Buddy's story is proof of that." She looked out at the crowded courtroom, her eyes locking onto familiar faces. Volunteers, supporters, families who had adopted pets from the shelter. "If you take this land away, you're not just shutting down a shelter. You're tearing a part of this town's heart." Everyone paused. No words were exchanged. Everyone knew. Her words were met with quiet nods and murmurs of agreement, even from some who had initially sided with the opposition. As the lawyers delivered their closing arguments, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. The corporate lawyer leaned into his arguments about economic viability and legal precedents, while Molly's team emphasized the shelter's irreplaceable role in the community. Ethan couldn't sit still. He kept glancing at Buddy, who seemed unusually alert, his head swiveling toward the door. At first, Ethan thought it was nothing, but then Buddy let out a low bark. "Buddy!" "Shh," Molly whispered, but the dog continued to growl softly, his eyes fixed on the back of the courtroom. Molly was clearly getting the vibe she sensed. Ethan followed Buddy's gaze and froze. Nathan Hale had entered the room, standing silently in the back. His presence sent a chill through Ethan, but it also reignited his determination. Nathan wasn't here to win. He was here to intimidate. Ethan leaned toward Molly. "He's trying to rattle us. Don't let him." Molly nodded, her jaw tightening. She straightened her posture and faced forward, refusing to let Nathan see any sign of fear. As the court moved toward deliberation, Molly's lawyer approached the bench with a final piece of evidence, a community petition signed by hundreds of residents supporting Hope's Haven. This petition, the lawyer explained, demonstrates the overwhelming public desire to preserve the shelter. It's not just about legality, it's about the will of the people. The corporate lawyer immediately objected, arguing that the petition held no legal weight. But the judge allowed it to be submitted as part of the record, citing the community's interest as a relevant factor in the case. The courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations as the petition was read aloud. Names of local families, business owners, and even some who had previously supported the development project were included. Nathan Hale, still standing in the back of the room, clenched his fists. His carefully constructed plans were unraveling before his eyes. During the recess, Nathan confronted Sarah Bennett in the hallway. "You're making a mistake," he hissed, his voice low but threatening. Sarah didn't flinch. "The only mistake I made was working for you," she replied. "This town deserves better, and so does Hope's Haven." Nathan's face darkened, but before he could respond, Ethan stepped into view. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his tone calm but firm. Nathan scoffed and walked away, but the tension lingered. Ethan turned to Sarah. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," she said, though her voice wavered slightly. "He's losing, and he knows it." "Thank you, ma'am." As the court reconvened, the judge announced that she would allow one final witness. To everyone's surprise, an elderly man in a wheelchair was wheeled into the courtroom. The witness was an attorney named Harry Cave, and he had been part of the prosecution's case. "This is Mr. Joseph Green," Molly's lawyer explained. "He is a longtime resident of Hopfield and one of the town's original landowners." The room fell silent as Mr. Green began to speak. "I sold the land that Hope's Haven sits on to Nathan Hale years ago," he said, his voice raspy but resolute. "But I never intended for it to be used for anything other than community benefit." He paused to catch his breath before continuing. "Nathan promised me that the shelter would remain untouched, but he lied. I may not have much time left, but I won't let him destroy what this town stands for. Nathan..." The weight of Mr. Green's testimony was palpable. Even the corporate lawyer seemed momentarily at a loss for words. As the hearing neared its conclusion, the tide seemed to have turned definitively in favor of Hope's Haven. Molly felt a flicker of hope, but she remained cautious. The final decision still rested with the judge, and anything could happen. Buddy sat quietly at her feet, his calm presence a reminder of why they were fighting. As the judge announced that she would deliver her verdict the next morning, Molly silently vowed to see this fight through to the end. The morning of the verdict, the courtroom was packed with supporters, journalists, and townspeople, all holding their breath as the judge entered. Molly sat next to Ethan, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Buddy rested his head on her knee, a steadying presence amidst the tension. The judge began by summarizing the key points of the case. She acknowledged the importance of economic development, but also emphasized the community's overwhelming support for Hope's Haven. "This case is about more than just land use," she said, her voice steady. "It's about the values we choose to uphold as a society. After careful consideration, I find in favor of Hope's Haven." The courtroom erupted in applause. Molly exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, tears welling in her eyes. Ethan smiled for the first time in weeks, giving her a reassuring nod. Buddy, as if sensing the victory, barked happily, drawing laughter from the crowd. Nathan Hale's reaction was one of barely concealed fury. He stormed out of the courtroom, refusing to speak to reporters who bombarded him with questions. Within days, his reputation in Hopfield was irreparably damaged, and his remaining business interests began to crumble under the weight of public backlash. Molly, Ethan, and Sarah knew they had won a significant battle, but they also recognized the importance of moving forward with integrity. When asked about Nathan in interviews, Molly focused on the shelter's mission rather than dwelling on their adversary. "We didn't fight to tear someone down," she said. "We fought to build something better." In the weeks following the verdict, Hope's Haven experienced a renaissance. Donations poured in from across the country, allowing Molly to make much-needed renovations to the shelter. New partnerships were formed with animal welfare organizations, expanding the shelter's reach and impact. Ethan, who had once been a reluctant ally, became an integral part of the shelter's operations. He offered free veterinary services to rescued animals and even began organizing community outreach programs to educate people about responsible pet ownership. Buddy, of course, remained the heart of Hope's Haven. His story continued to inspire visitors, and he became a symbol of resilience and loyalty. Children loved visiting the shelter to meet the famous hospital dog, and Buddy took it all in stride, basking in the attention. One evening, as Molly and Ethan stood outside the shelter watching the sun set over Hopfield, they reflected on how far they had come. "Do you think Jackson would be proud?" Molly asked softly. Ethan nodded. "Without a doubt. You've built something incredible here, Molly. And it's just the beginning." Molly smiled, her gaze shifting to Buddy, who was playing with a group of newly rescued puppies. "We all did this," she said. "Buddy, you, me, everyone. And now it's time to keep going." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the shelter in golden light, Molly felt a deep sense of peace. Hope's Haven wasn't just a shelter anymore. It was a beacon of hope, a testament to what could be achieved when people stood together for what was right. Months after the verdict, Hope's Haven had transformed into a thriving sanctuary. The once crumbling facilities now boasted freshly painted walls, spacious outdoor play areas for the animals, and a new medical wing funded by generous donations. Molly could hardly believe how far they had come. Every morning, she walked through the shelter, greeting the animals and checking in with the staff and volunteers. The sight of families adopting pets brought her the greatest joy. A young boy carefully choosing a kitten, an elderly couple adopting an older dog. These moments were proof of the shelter's impact. Buddy, ever the star, had become an icon. Local schools invited Molly to speak about the shelter's work, and Buddy always accompanied her, delighting children with his calm demeanor and wagging tail. For Ethan, life had changed in ways he never expected. The quiet pediatrician who once avoided personal connections had become an integral part of the shelter's community. "Dr. Reed," one of the volunteers teased one day as he examined a rescued puppy, "you might as well move in here. You spend more time at the shelter than the hospital." Ethan chuckled. "Don't tempt me," he said, scratching the puppy behind its ears. The cat was startled in its sleep. He still worked at the hospital, but his evenings and weekends were devoted to Hope's Haven. The work gave him a renewed sense of purpose, and for the first time since his family's death, he felt like he was part of something meaningful. One afternoon, a familiar face walked through the shelter doors. Mr. Joseph Green. The elderly man who had testified in court looked frailer than Molly remembered, but his smile was as warm as ever. "I had to see it for myself," Mr. Green said, his voice shaky but filled with pride. "You've done something remarkable here." Molly guided him through the shelter, showing him the improvements and introducing him to the animals. When they reached Buddy, Mr. Green's eyes softened. "So this is the famous Buddy," he said, kneeling down to pet the dog. "You're a good boy, aren't you?" Buddy responded with a wag of his tail, leaning into the man's touch. Before he left, Mr. Green handed Molly an envelope. Inside was a handwritten note and a check. "For the future of Hope's Haven," the note read. Molly's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you, Mr. Green. This means more than you know." He smiled. "Just keep doing what you're doing. This town needs a place like this." Hope's Haven's success began to ripple outward. Molly was contacted by several animal welfare organizations interested in replicating the shelter's model. They proposed a collaboration to establish similar shelters across the state, using Hope's Haven as the flagship example. At first, Molly hesitated. The idea of expanding was exciting but overwhelming. "It's a lot to take on," she admitted to Ethan during one of their evening walks around the shelter grounds. Afterward, they sat on the veranda, sipping Turkish coffee and watched the bouncy elephants. Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "It is, but look at what you've already done here. If anyone can make this work, it's you." Molly smiled, touched by his faith in her. "Not just me," she said. "Us. This has always been a team effort." They decided to move forward with the partnership, and soon plans were underway to open 2 new shelters in neighboring towns. Molly worked tirelessly to ensure the new facilities embodied the same principles as Hope's Haven: compassion, community, and second chances. As the shelter's influence grew, so did Buddy's fame. He became the face of the statewide campaign, his image appearing on posters, billboards, and social media ads. The tagline, "Every animal deserves a buddy," resonated with people, encouraging adoptions and donations. Despite his growing celebrity, Buddy remained the same loyal, gentle dog he had always been. At the shelter, he spent his days napping in sunny spots or playing with the other animals. Children loved hearing his story during school visits, and Buddy seemed to thrive on their attention. One day, Molly received a letter from a family who had adopted a dog through the campaign. The letter included a photo of the family and their new pet, along with a heartfelt note. "Buddy's story inspired us to adopt. Thank you for giving animals like him a chance." Molly framed the letter and hung it in the shelter's office. It was a reminder of why they did this work and how far they had come. Ethan's transformation wasn't limited to his role at the shelter. Inspired by the sense of purpose he found at Hope's Haven, he began opening up to the people around him. He reconnected with old friends and even started mentoring young doctors at the hospital. Molly noticed the change in him and couldn't help but feel proud. "You're not the same man I met outside the hospital that night," she said one evening as they worked together in the shelter's medical wing. Ethan smiled. "Neither are you," he replied. "I think Buddy changed both of us." "You think this protest is causing this?" Ethan asked. "Is that why Buddy's so attached to both of you, Jamie?" Molly laughed softly. "He has a way of doing that, doesn't he?" The bond between Ethan and Molly deepened over time, built on shared experiences and mutual respect. Though neither of them spoke it aloud, there was an unspoken understanding that their partnership had grown into something more. Months later, Hope's Haven held its first annual celebration of hope, an event to honor the shelter's journey and the animals it had saved. The town square was transformed into a festive space filled with lights, booths, and music. Families strolled through with their pets, many of whom had been adopted from the shelter. Molly stood on the makeshift stage, microphone in hand, looking out at the crowd. Her heart swelled with gratitude. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she began, her voice carrying across the square. "Hope's Haven wouldn't be what it is today without each and every one of you." She recounted the shelter's challenges and triumphs, highlighting the role the community had played in its success. When she mentioned Buddy, the crowd erupted in cheers. Buddy, sitting beside her on stage, wagged his tail as if acknowledging the applause. "This shelter started as a dream," Molly continued, "and because of all of you, it's become something so much more. A place where hope is real and second chances are possible." The evening ended with a slideshow of photos showcasing the animals that had passed through Hope's Haven over the years. As images of happy, healthy pets flashed on the screen, Molly felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The pets had truly learned to accept the threat and the downplay from the stranger in the box. As the event wound down, Molly and Ethan found a quiet moment to sit together on a bench overlooking the square. Buddy lay at their feet, his head resting on his paws. "You did something incredible here," Ethan said, breaking the comfortable silence. Molly shook her head. "We did. All of us, Buddy included." Ethan smiled. "What's next for Hope's Haven?" Molly thought for a moment, her gaze drifting toward the distant horizon. "Keep growing. Keep helping. There's always more we can do." Ethan nodded. "Whatever it is, you won't be doing it alone." Molly turned to him, her smile warm. "I know, that makes all the difference." Buddy lived out the rest of his days as the beloved heart of Hope's Haven. Though he grew older and slower with time, his spirit remained unbroken. He continued to greet visitors, inspire adoptions, and served as a living reminder of the shelter's mission. When Buddy passed peacefully in his sleep years later, the news was met with an outpouring of love and tributes from around the world. People shared stories of how Buddy had touched their lives, and Hope's Haven held a memorial in his honor. The shelter dedicated its largest play area to Buddy's memory, naming it Buddy's Field of Hope. It became a place where animals and their new families could run, play, and begin their own journeys of healing and love. Hope's Haven continued to thrive, expanding its reach and impact year after year. Molly, Ethan, and their team remained dedicated to the shelter's mission, carrying forward the lessons Buddy had taught them: loyalty, resilience, and the transformative power of hope. As Molly stood in Buddy's field one evening, watching the sun set over the happy chaos of playing animals and laughing families, she felt a deep sense of peace. Hope's Haven wasn't just a shelter. It was a promise, a legacy, and a testament to what could be achieved when people came together for a cause greater than themselves. The story of Hope's Haven was, at its core, a testament to the power of resilience. Through every challenge, from financial struggles to legal battles, the shelter had stood firm, buoyed by the unwavering dedication of Molly, Ethan, and the community. Buddy's journey embodied this resilience. Once an abandoned dog waiting outside a hospital, Buddy had found not only a home but a purpose. His story reminded people that even in the face of loss and uncertainty, there was always the potential for renewal. Molly often reflected on the lessons Buddy had taught her. "He never gave up," she would say during interviews and speeches. "And neither should we. No matter how hopeless things seem, there's always a way forward." This message resonated far beyond Hopfield. Schools invited Molly to speak about Hope's Haven and the importance of animal welfare. Buddy's story became a case study for resilience, inspiring not just children, but people of all ages to persevere in their own lives. As Hope's Haven gained prominence, Molly and Ethan were invited to share their experiences on a national stage. They appeared on morning shows, podcasts, and even testified before a congressional panel on the importance of funding for animal shelters. One memorable moment occurred during a live television interview when the host asked Molly what advice she would give to others facing adversity. "Start small," Molly said. "Take one step, then another. Surround yourself with people who believe in you, and never underestimate the power of kindness. It can change everything." Ethan, who usually shied away from the spotlight, added, "And don't be afraid to let others in. I learned that the hard way. Sometimes the connections you make can heal more than you realize." Their words struck a chord, and the interview went viral, sparking a wave of donations and volunteer sign-ups for animal shelters across the country. Soon after, the villagers advanced their signs to the common room, the house, a multi-story building that included a common cook fire. In the years that followed, Hope's Haven expanded into a network of shelters under the banner of Buddy's legacy. Each location carried the same mission: to provide a haven for animals and a place for people to find hope. Molly became a leading voice in the animal welfare movement, while Ethan continued his work both as a pediatrician and as a mentor for young veterinarians. Together, they oversaw the growth of the network, ensuring that each shelter upheld the values that had made Hope's Haven a success. Buddy's Field of Hope remained the heart of the original shelter, a place where families and animals could connect and thrive. Every year, on the anniversary of Buddy's adoption, the shelter held a celebration in his honor, drawing people from across the state to Hopfield. The influence of Hope's Haven stretched far beyond its humble beginnings. As Buddy's legacy shelters opened across the country, they brought communities together, fostering compassion and understanding. Each new shelter told its own stories of resilience and renewal, inspired by the examples set in Hopfield. Molly and Ethan worked tirelessly to ensure that the network retained its authenticity. They traveled to each new shelter during its opening, sharing Buddy's story and connecting with the local volunteers and staff. In her speeches, Molly emphasized that the shelters were not just for animals but for people too. "This work isn't just about saving lives," she said. "It's about creating a space where everyone, human or animal, can find a second chance." Ethan, though still reserved in public, found his role as a mentor deeply fulfilling. He helped train shelter staff to handle the medical needs of the animals, passing on the knowledge he had gained both as a doctor and through his work at Hope's Haven. Years later, on the 10th anniversary of Hope's Haven's victory in court, the town of Hopfield held a special celebration to honor Molly, Ethan, and the shelter's legacy. The entire town square was decorated with lights and banners bearing Buddy's image. Molly stood on stage, looking out at the crowd that had gathered to celebrate. Many faces were familiar: volunteers, adopters, and supporters who had been there from the beginning. Others were new, drawn to the shelter's mission through the expanded network. When it was Ethan's turn to speak, he kept his words simple. "I didn't expect to find a home here," he said, glancing at Molly. "But Hope's Haven isn't just a shelter. It's a family, and I'm grateful to be part of it." Molly felt her heart swell with emotion as the crowd erupted in applause. She knew that none of this would have been possible without the people standing before her. And without Buddy. As the night wound down, Molly and Ethan sat together near Buddy's field of hope, watching families and animals play under the soft glow of string lights. "Do you think Buddy knew what he started?" Molly asked, her voice quiet. Ethan smiled. "I think he knew exactly what he was doing. He found us when we needed him most." Molly nodded, her gaze fixed on the joyful scene before her. "We'll keep it going," she said firmly. "For Buddy, for everyone who needs a place like this." Hope's Haven had grown beyond anything Molly could have imagined, but its core mission remained the same: to give life to the forgotten, hope to the lost, and a second chance to all who needed it. As the lights dimmed and the crowd dispersed, Molly felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Hope's Haven wasn't just a shelter or a legacy. It was a promise.